Do you love marshes along the coast? Do they inspire you to paint them but feel intimidated by the details? Today, I'll show you how to simplify that marsh scene while painting on plein air and the secret to getting realistic reflections in water. In 8 steps, we'll have a complete marsh scene in watercolor. Here are the paints that I'll use in this painting. This is a reference photo for what I'm about to paint. Here's the drawing. I'm not going to put in the details of the 2 houses you can see easily. I'm just going to put their silhouettes as part of the backlit background. All I'll leave in is some of the covers over the docks, the fence, the marsh grass, the fishermen, their boats, and the reflections in the water. Using cobalt blue, I'm brushing in wet onto dry the sky. I'm going to let that color bleed down as I add clear water to lighten it as we get closer to the horizon. The brush I'm using is a Princeton Neptune Quill size 8. I'll mostly paint over these structures with this light blue because the structures are backlit and so they'll be mostly in shadow anyway. While the sky is still wet, I'm dropping in a combination of undersea green and shadow green for the trees. Because the paper's still wet, the paint's going to bleed a little bit and give a fuzzy feel, so it looks like leaves in the distance. This is one of the things I really like about this quill brush is that I can use it for big washes, and then because it comes down to a fine point, I can start working on details without having to change brushes. Now that the sky has started to dry, I can put in the rooftops and still get a hard edge. By not adding in the details for these houses, but simply suggesting their presence with their rooftops, it greatly simplifies the composition. Spritzing the paper allows me to have a longer working time since I knew I needed to add a little bit more paint into those background trees. So I thought I was being efficient by running the horizontal lines of the fence all the way across the page. Well, guess what? That meant that I covered over the posts that were supposed to remain light, so I'm lifting them. I caught it right away. The paint's still wet. This is something you can do, especially with not very staining colors. Here I'm depicting the marsh grass that you can see at the bottom of the fence in the distance. This is wet onto dry. And now I'm softening that edge so it blends into the rest of the composition, getting ready for the water later on. That's a trick you can do when you know you need to paint something, but by the time you get back to that area and you want a soft edge, you can bleed it out with clean water, and then that way you won't have harsh lines between your objects. Now I'm darkening the base of the marsh grass and painting in the shadows of the posts. This is a combination of wet on dry where the posts are and wet on wet below them. I'm painting wet on wet because the grass is fuzzy in the distance, and this is part of the reflection of the grass in the water, so it needs to look fuzzy. Using clean water to allow those colors to bleed. So the tops of the marsh grass will bleed into the background. I needed to start it while the green grass by the fence is still wet, and I'll finish it later. This is a combination of burnt sienna and Serpentine genuine. I'm now going to paint in the water. This is a combination of cobalt blue, a little tiny bit of the greens I've been using a little bit by accident. And if you notice, I'm working wet onto dry, but my brush is fully loaded. So I'm starting with the dark color at the bottom. Now I've gone back with a clean brush, which will cause the blue color at the bottom of the paper to start to migrate upwards. I'm not worried about putting any pigment over the figures. They're going to get a lot of detail later. Here I'm deepening that gradient, and I don't have to worry too much about how perfect the brush strokes are, because it's wet, they'll start to smooth out with a little more brushwork. I've dropped in a little bit of Winsor Violet to start to deepen that color at the bottom of the page. And to encourage the pigment to move up the page, I've turned the board upside down. While I'm waiting for the blue water on the paper to completely dry, I can finish the marsh grass on the right. First, I'm laying down clean water because I want to work wet and wet. This is Serpentine Genuine. I'm using a liner brush. This is a Escoda. There are other brands you can use to get the shadows of the grasses. It's sort of a combination of wet on dry and wet on wet. The trick is to put the bristles where the paper is dry and stroke the paint up into the wet area so then it'll bleed. By doing it that way, the very bottom of your shadow has really dark value. Good job. Now that the rest of the paper is dry, I can start to paint in the boats and the figures. I'm using shadow green as the shadow color on the boat. These are the reflections of the boat in the water. Now I'm starting to paint in the reflections of the marsh grass in the water. The paper is dry, so I'm working wet onto dry. And this is the trick. When you want to do reflections in still water, you need contrast. I'm using Undersea green. Now my reflection didn't go down as dark as I'd hoped, so I actually went back and worked to deepen that color, to get that reflection to blend downwards and fade out. I've laid down some clean water that the paint can run into. Here I'm adding shadow green to deepen the color. For the shadow of the boat, and I'm making the boat white, I'm using a combination of cobalt blue, a little tiny bit of Winsor violet, a little goes a long way, and that gives a realistic shadow color. And don't worry if it picks up colors from, like the green color nearby it. That just helps unify the painting. Now this area I'm trying to paint the reflections of the grass as it leans and bends towards the water, so it's a bit of an angle. I'm using a grayish blue with a touch of Winsor violet to make a shadow on the back of this figure. Now I'm using a little bit of raw umber to put some shadows on the face, some shadows on the back of the shorts, and the legs and arms. I need to adjust the water. It's just not dark enough at the bottom, so I'm going in with a gray color that's a combination of cobalt blue, raw umber, and a little bit of Winsor violet, wet on dry. I'm painting upside down to let gravity work for me. Same technique as before, dark at the top of the gradient, and then come back with some clean water to let that color bleed down. Still, I needed to add even more pigment. This is a heavier combination of cobalt blue with Winsor violet. Further adjustments are to darken the trees, put the shadows on the dock structures. I'm using shadow green. Now I'm using a technique called negative painting. The fence is brown, but I wanted to make it white because I thought that would be prettier. And so I'm simply going in with some shadow green in between the rungs to make that fence stand out. Using a combination of shadow green and cobalt blue, I'm painting wet on dry to show the reflections of the trees in the water. Again, the trick is to get contrast, and wet on dry allows me to get that. Trying to keep my arm straight. Watch how I hold my brush almost parallel with the paper to get a dry brush technique on the paper. This is a great way to show sparkle on the water. A little more adjustment on the water. I'm putting down some clean water. I'm going to go back with a little bit of blue to show some ripples. And that's cobalt blue. I'm adjusting the reflection of the trees because generally objects look darker in water than they actually are. This is shadow green. I'm deepening the color of the marsh grass around this figure to help him stand out. Now I'm using a dry brush technique with my liner brush to add some texture to the marsh grass. To finish off the reflections of the marsh grass on the right, I'm using a combination first of Serpentine Genuine, then Shadow Green. To darken the reflections of the people, I'm using a combination of Cobalt Blue, Raw Umber, and a little bit of Winsor Violet.